Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Maura Moyle, and I am on the board of directors for the Reading League Wisconsin, and also a faculty member at Marquette University. I'm joined by Mary Newton, the vice president of the Reading League Wisconsin, and we're very excited to present Amy McGovern, who is also on the board of directors of the Reading League Wisconsin. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So Amy McGovern is the Associate Director of Continuous School Improvement Services, a reading specialist, and the Title III coordinator at CISA number 9. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her background. And we're just very excited to be hearing about multilingual learners tonight.
Are we ready to start?
Yes, I think we could go ahead.
Awesome.
Let me let 2 more people in.
Do you want to, should we unlock the waiting room or I see we can't. Okay. Yeah. Keep watching the waiting room.
Yes, and I also will be giving you more information toward the end of the session on requesting a certificate of attendance, and also letting you know about some exciting events coming up this summer.
Hey. All right, everyone. It's good to be here. Can you all still hear me okay?
Yes, sounds
Excellent.
great.
And you can see my screen, I hope. Okay. You can't see my screen anymore? You can. You can.
I can
okay.
see it. Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Excellent. All right, so we are going to talk about the science of reading with ELs and multilingual education tonight. And a little bit about me. I, as Morris, she did do my job title correct. I have quite a bit of experience. I'm not an EL certified educator. I'm a reading specialist first, but I spent quite a bit of time across my 29 years working with and supporting English language learners. And when that crossroads came where I had to decide, am I going to get my EL certification or my reading specialist certification, I chose to go the path of reading specialist. But it was after acquiring much boots on the ground experience with supporting ELs. I worked in 2 bilingual schools in a large urban setting, Spanish speaking, and then moved to the North Woods where in central Wisconsin, north central Wisconsin, where we have a large Hmong and Spanish speaking population here. So, and I've had some fabulous mentors. So I bring to you some practical real world information combined with both mixing my reading specialist background and my firsthand experience working with second language learners and the teachers who support them. So in the chat, if you wouldn't mind sharing who you are and where you are, if you have students in your classrooms that speak other languages, that would be lovely to know. And I'm curious to know what you might be hoping to gain out of tonight's presentation. I know we are recording it, so the audience that sees this on recording, hopefully will see the transcript as well. See your comments. I'm just going to locate my chat here while you're adding in that information. Hey, welcome. And we will keep things moving since we only have an hour. So again, just add in where you're from. If you have EL students in your classroom, and if you'd like to share something you hope to gain tonight, I'd love to know that. Excellent. 39 languages. Wow, wonderful, Samantha. Welcome. Very familiar with the many languages of Milwaukee. Okay, so I would only be appropriate to remind ourselves of how we should welcome our immigrant students and making sure that their families know that they are entitled to be in school regardless of their citizenship status. And this document definitely helps explain that. And it's actually in Spanish and in English. So I will throw it into the chat, and all of these links will be available when we post the recording. So everything will be there for you. Anyone familiar with this document? So it's a really nice overview of what parents should be able to expect to experience, what public schools can and cannot do. Their immigration status is private. So it's important for them to know, to feel safe in the school and to feel that they can reach out for support and help. So take a look at that when you have time. Title III does ensure that all children, regardless of where they're born, do have access to free public school education. So tonight, our targets are grounding in the why of this presentation and to gain some insights about how the science of reading actually supports the research around bilingual education, multi-learner supports. So there is a nice crossover between how we teach reading and how we support English language learners. And I will showcase some of those details tonight. We will also briefly talk about a handful of instructional practices that honor our EL students and also are good for our native English speakers. So it's important to note that what is good for one is good for the other, generally speaking. And then I'll share a couple of resources on assessments for ELs. And this is more from the systems perspective. For those of you that are coordinators, I see as I'm looking through the chat that there's quite a few coordinators in this audience. So that'll be a useful tool for you as well. So just to ground us, some facts about ELs in the US schools. Over 5 million children speak another language besides English in our schools today. And unfortunately, fewer than 1/6 of the educators have had any type of support in language pedagogy, second language acquisition. So they are really at a deficit in understanding how to support students whose first language is not English. And if they are in a situation where they get to learn something about other cultures or languages, it tends to be from the cultural perspective versus the linguistic diversity perspective. So what's the difference between those two things? Cultural diversity is really considering the traditions, beliefs, customs, practices of a particular group of people in a particular area of the country or the world. And we think about their religion, their, smaller so you can all see it, their cuisine, their music, art, the social norms. That's our cultural diversity. And in a nutshell, there's certainly more to it. Versus linguistic diversity, which is much more complex. This is really about the language that different groups of people speak. Oops. Uh-oh. I don't know why my computer restarted that, but we will get right back to it. Technology. So when we think of linguistic diversity, we're thinking about the dialect. There are many, many dialects in the Spanish language, for example. The order of the words tends the grammar, the syntax between English and whatever other language it is highly likely not to be the same. So that's a challenge. The words, the number of words, the vocabulary between the English language and the second language or the third or fourth for some instances. Those speech sounds, what are they? What's similar or what's different between the two languages? And finally, how does that translate into print? Because we know we want to move from speech to print when we're teaching native English speakers to read. Does that work in the same way if we are teaching a bilingual student or a soon-to-be bilingual or trilingual or multilingual student? So we want to reflect on this difference between these two and understand that most of the teachers who are having newcomers or children, emergent bilinguals in their classrooms, really are at a deficit in terms of understanding these differences. And those of you who support them, we want to give you as many tools as possible for that. So in the United States, this is a chart that comes from the IES report on English learners in public schools. It was last updated in May of 2023. This chart is from fall of 2020. So we're seeing that there are a variety of languages spoken across the country. Spanish still is the dominant one, with 75% of our EL students speaking Spanish. And then Arabic was the next most popular language. So you can see down the list that we have a wide range that occur in our classrooms across the country, which means that we need to be aware of these linguistic challenges and these differences between English and that second language. When we think about the percentage of public school students who were English learners by grade level, this is also from that same report. You can see that the percentage of students is quite high in the early elementary grades. And as of course you'd like to see, the older they get, the more English they've acquired. And so we have fewer students who are in high school who are identified as ELs. It takes approximately 5 years to acquire sufficient English proficiency. And I do say approximately. For some children, it's much quicker, and for others, it's much longer. So we need to be really sensitive to that. I'm not sure how many teachers are aware of that silent stage when we have newcomers that come into school. We need to be sure that they understand that that child might not say anything at all for quite some time. It could be months, it could be weeks, it could be the school year where they are really super quiet because they are just trying to figure things out and process. And I can't even imagine what that would feel like to be bombarded with a language that is not my first language all day long and have no way to escape it. So it's really important that we let teachers know about that silent stage and that there's that progression. So that was a little side note on there. So when we think about the science of reading and the definition of the science of reading, this is right from the Science of Reading Defining Guide that the Reading League helped to put together and promote. It's available for free, and it's linked to the end of this slide deck as well. We know that the research on the science of reading has been conducted across 5 decades at least, and that it does in fact include thousands of studies, many of which are from countries other than English-speaking countries. So multiple languages have been studied when we think about how we acquire literacy, how we become literate. So it's a myth to suggest that we don't have anything related to multilingual learners in the science of reading. Definitely want to bust that myth. Okay. Oh, Samantha, I have a student who hasn't yet spoken. Is a year really normal? Well, there can be other reasons why students don't speak. Sometimes you have selective mutism, and sometimes you have, a language issue. So there can be lots of reasons. I would do some investigating, but it can be. So the science is derived from researchers in multiple fields. You can read down the list. We see linguistics is included on the list, neuroscience, education, special ed, huge body of work that contributes to the science of reading. Oops, sorry about that. Still seeing my screen? Having technical difficulties tonight, I apologize. All right, let's try this one more time. Okay, so as important as what the definition of the science of reading is, we also need to think about what it's not. Not a philosophy, a fad, certainly not a political agenda, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, or a particular type of programming. And it's certainly not just phonics. That's the big myth about the science of reading. It is much broader than all of those things, and it encompasses the simple view of reading, right? That word recognition strand. You're still seeing my previous slide. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know that. I'm just gonna switch some things around really quickly. Put you guys back over here. Thank you for your patience, and I might be looking in the wrong direction, but we'll make that work. So you should be seeing the simple view of reading slide, correct? Okay. So as I was saying, this is true of how all of us learn to read, whether we're learning to read, as long as we're reading an alphabetic print, right? We need that word recognition strand to be developed, the language comprehension strand, and that's how we develop our reading comprehension. The simple view has been reaffirmed. Over 150 studies have verified that these are in fact the 2 major components that contribute to reading comprehension. And as we unpack that further, we think about the reading rope. And we think about ELs in this, right? And so their language comprehension, we all build on background knowledge. We all need vocabulary and language structures and verbal reasoning skills and literacy knowledge. That is some of the key components of language comprehension. And theirs, of course, is coming in a language other than English. So we have to tap into that cultural knowledge as well as the linguistic knowledge. Word recognition, the usual things we need, right? Phonological awareness, decoding and encoding, and then the ability to read words instantly and automatically by sight. So one of the first things you want to know about your student is, can they read in their first language? Where are they on that spectrum? So if they can read in their first language, well, then we're one step ahead. We're not teaching the concept of reading. We're thinking about how we teach the language and understand which phonemes are similar or different, which the syntax and so on. It's a different game when you've got a reader in their first language. So of course, over time, these things develop and we get a skilled reader, and regardless of what your language is that you're reading in. And we see the simple view adding in. So again, from that guide, the science of reading does include children with linguistic differences, and I've underlined a couple key points. All proficient readers need to master the same concepts in order to learn to read. It's just important to provide students with linguistic differences a focus on oral language development. So we know that oral language is the grounding of all literacy, and it continues to be true whether we're teaching students to read in their first language or in another language. And we want to celebrate these differences. I don't know how many of you have seen that research that shows that anyone who can speak more than one language activates more parts of their brain. Their brains are literally bigger. It is truly a gift to be able to speak more than one language. I've tried myself to learn 3 other languages and have not been able, I never got past the silent stage when placed into a conversational scenario. So the linguistic differences that children bring really do need to be honored. And I've had the great privilege of watching some children, 4th graders, 5th graders coming who don't speak any English at all, Spanish speakers, and their classmates just embracing them and figuring out all the different ways they can communicate back and forth with a student who doesn't speak English at all. So as long as the teachers can really celebrate that, it's a tremendous asset to have in your classroom. So teachers of multilingual learners do need to consider the similarities and differences between the 2 languages. And as I mentioned before, you want to know, is this an alphabetic system like English, or is it a logographic system? Is it more like Chinese where there's symbols? Is the text read from right to left, from left to right? So Arabic, if you're an Arabic reader, you're reading the opposite direction. Chinese often is written vertically, so that's another issue. What phonemes, what speech sounds are shared between the 2 languages? And is there a common root language that we can build on? So we're going to unpack a couple of these pieces because these are the questions if you have students who are coming to school, speaking another language, you need to do some homework on what their L1 is, their language 1 is. So we're going to lean on Spanish because it is the most common of the languages that are spoken in our classrooms in the United States, second language. So everything in yellow, these are the phonemes that are shared between English and Spanish. There are 14 phonemes, 15 if you count up, it's on the slide, that are shared between English and Spanish. And then there are some that are unique to Spanish. And with any instruction, we do better when we build from the known. So I'm going to want to know and select words and phrases and sounds that capitalize on what is the same between English and Spanish, especially if I'm in that learning to read mode. The ones in red are only in Spanish. So we have that ñ sound like in, niño, and the way the H is pronounced, which I'm not going to do well, so I'm not going to try. So, oops, get that up there. Spanish only has 5 vowel phonemes. They are this also pronounced in English, these 5 phonemes. However, they're not all spelled the same. So we have the E, right, which is spelled with the letter I in Spanish. And the opposite is true, right? So this EI combination we need to be aware of. So if students are writing a vowel sound and they misplace that letter, they're really not. They're saying it the way they know it in their first language. And awareness of that is vitally important. There are some resources that you can tap into that help showcase the phonemes. This one happens to come from Coloring Colorado on the difference between Spanish and English. And it's just a couple snapshots of a really lovely article that explains these things in great detail, empowering the teacher to make, actually, I'll say in just enough detail, not great deal, in just enough detail to give you what you need to know to be a little smarter than you were before on how to support that Spanish speaker. So reading and spelling in English, it can take 2 years longer to learn a language that is not phonologically transparent. So when we think about a transparent language like Spanish or German or Italian, these are phonetic languages for the most part. And so I can read Spanish. I don't always know what I'm saying, but I can read it, pronounce some of those words, despite not remembering how to say that H sound correctly in isolation. But that the vocabulary part is tricky. So we want to think about the English orthography and understand that 55% of our language has a Latin origin, and that there are 30 to 40% of the cognates between these two languages are the same. So we want to build on this and help kids, especially if we have readers, use that to their benefit. So cognates are words that link English with languages like Spanish, French, and Italian. And I mentioned those 4th and 5th grade readers as we were trying to encourage the kids to support these students. And one simple and kind of fun way to approach this is to ask that reader to read down the list in Spanish for just a few of the words and put a star next to any of the words they know what that word means. And then they can say it in Spanish, and then a student can say it in English, or the teacher, and we can talk about what's similar or different, right? So the student is learning that English word that they already have a Spanish word for, and having that interaction, that sort of safe conversation opportunity, very limited with a native English speaker. It's a nice invitation in to sharing something that they both have in common. So cognates are a useful way to begin that language development piece. Again, I'm not expecting kids to memorize these things or anything like that, but just as a friendly way in. So it's true with all learning that building from the known is definitely powerful. We're more likely to remember what we have a hook for in our long-term memory. So that short-term piece is going to come in, and it's only going to land into the long-term if it's got a connection, right? And not a lot of repetition. So building from the known is vitally important. The question then is whether we're speaking in English or Spanish or whatever that second language is, the process of orthographic mapping is true. I'm just going to survey the group here. How many of you, and you can just put a little yes in the chat or question mark, are familiar with orthographic mapping? Is that something that you've heard this term before? If you follow the signs of reading, you might. If this is one of your first experiences, then maybe not. Let's get in my chat so I can see it. Oh, yes. Okay, good. I'm seeing lots of yeses. Excellent. So orthographic mapping is how we get words to be able to be instantly and automatically read and understood. So we need that letter knowledge, that sound knowledge, phoneme, grapheme knowledge. We need the pronunciation of the word, and we need the meaning. I was recently speaking with a teacher who was a Poland for a little while, and he was an ESL teacher in Poland. He was teaching English to native Polish speakers, and he was having a hard time picking up how to read and speak and pronounce Polish because there's so many extra consonants in the Polish language that he couldn't break it down, and he also didn't know what the words meant. So even if he had the phonology, he didn't have the vocabulary. He was missing one of these components. That will be true for your second language learners here as well. One sec. Need all three to be mastered in order for a word to be retained. And we have the double challenge of trying to process the English phonemes and the meaning. So this is where images become really useful. So if I have the word fish, I'm showing a fish, I'm saying the sounds in fish. And if you've heard of the picture word inductive model, this is a great way to showcase language and get kids speaking, call and response. The fish swims in the pond, and identify what the nouns are, identify what the action is, act it out, talk about the prepositional phrase here, what in versus on, acting that out. So all of these elements can help make this little word fish come to life. Have you used the picture word inductive model? Is this a familiarity with anyone? I have that in a few slides up. We have a few more. For those of you that are not familiar with it, and I've got the links here, this is a combination of Coloring Colorado and this other site linked under here. Basically, you take an image that's kind of complex and you identify all the nouns. And you keep the article in front. So you have the wolf, the bear, the bush, and it's I say, you say, right? And then you add the verbs. This is over the course of time here, maybe a few days. And then finally, you add the prepositional phrase, the rest of the sentence. And so in this process, they're getting all of the benefit of repetition, of seeing the print, the pronunciation, the action. And over time, the content is going to start to stick. So there's a lot of oral language. We know that we need to give our EL students and our native English speakers a tremendous amount of time to talk. So while this is a really common usage for EL students, I think this is a benefit for all kids because they all need to work on sentence structure and syntax. And this is a great way to showcase those features of the English language, the order of the words that make it more complex or less complex than their language. So highly recommend this strategy. So you select a detailed image, you label all the nouns, you identify all the verbs, and then you work through the subject predicate relationship, acting it out as necessary, using images to reinforce the vocabulary. So in the end, what we know about English language learners and what we know about native English speakers is that we need to focus on our assets, right? And we need to integrate all 4 domains: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, which is what that last practice did. If you don't have discussion protocols in your classroom, then it's vitally important to develop those, but also the awareness of the silent stage and the stages that are following that, where kids are just tiptoeing into communicating with their classmates. I know that there's a big push to use translation apps and Google Classroom translation, and certainly that there is a place for that because we want kids to be able to understand what's going on. They also need just the opportunity to safely communicate and try on the language in a controlled space that feels safe. Graphic organizers are helpful, and obviously using read alouds every day is going to help build their language, especially if you combine it with something like that picture inductive model where you're identifying and labeling things and doing a call and response, helping kids make connections. So again, good for all kids, highly beneficial and necessary for your second language learners. So this resource comes from MTSS for ELs, and I will add that link. It is actually on the slide deck, which you'll see. This resource has several other things in it, including an assessment document. I'm just going to pull it open here. I have it on a different tab. So here's the home page that we were just on. And I'll throw this into the chat if you haven't seen it before. Under the tools document, you'll see some pieces that so here's discussion protocol for accountable talk, a toolkit for developing that, same with text talk, a read aloud routine. All of these would be great things to share with teachers who have EL students in their classrooms, benefits all. And then the other one, if you're thinking from a systems perspective, assessing your students whose English is not their first language, we need to have some extra sensitivity. So there is an implementation rubric here that lets you review your MTSS process through the lens of your English language learners. And it starts with where you think it should start at the screening level. Do we have screeners that allow for us to match? Do we have some screeners in their first language? We might not, but if we have access to those, it's useful to have knowledge about their literacy levels in their home language. So this gives you a rating scale and some suggested ideas on what to do if you don't have those pieces. Progress monitoring, same thing. Database decision making, how are we thinking through our problem solving with our students who are EL students? And at the end, there's details about our overall system, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So it's a useful document to do a self-check on, thinking through your overall support system for multilingual learners. There are a lot of things we can lean in on, a lot of supports. Literacy Foundations for English Learners is a great resource to do as a book study if you are in a district that has a lot of EL students and you're trying to figure out how to support them. This is sort of like speech to print, but for ELs. There is a guided book study with the authors through Patton in Pennsylvania, available, and the recordings are available as well. Highly recommend that as a resource. The Science of Reading, a defining guide, indicates, and I shared with you some of those resources directly related to EL students. There are some hyperlinks within that resource that take you to research that includes multilingual learners. And it is, I can't emphasize enough that if we focus on oral language development, honoring the needs of the EL student, and build from the known, we're going to make greater gains than if we, try other ways, or sadly don't do anything at all, which sometimes happens. I work in a part of the state that has a lot of rural school districts where there's only some support available for EL students. So it's vitally important for the classroom teachers to have as many strategies and resources as possible and to understand the needs of those English language learners. So what you see on the screen are things that I've shared with several of the teachers that I've used and in our network. Okay, we're done a little sooner, so let's take some time if there's conversation or questions that we want to address.
Do you see the
Okay.
question in the chat, Amy, on Spanish screeners that are aligned with signs of reading as opposed to doing a Spanish running record?
The one I always recommend comes from Acadience, the screener. They have a Spanish Acadience version, and that is a really strong resource for you if you have somebody who speaks Spanish. It does require scoring it. That's what I would recommend. Maura, do you have anything that you would share?
Or, yeah, well, it's always like, I think you covered a lot of the bases. We'd always want to know their language proficiency in their first or primary language. Like in the case of, whoever said, I'm sorry, I missed or I'm blanking on your name, but, said there's a silent period going on for almost a year. Is there a language impairment in that first language? Parents are always good to interview to see if they have concerns. How does that child compare to children from a similar background with a similar exposure to English? So really getting a good language history is really important. Are they literate in their first language? I think, is the family literate, or is written language kind of a new thing? Have they not been exposed to reading and writing? I think those are all really good, like everything you said. It's a good case history, and language history is always really important. As far as specific screeners in reading in Spanish, I'm a speech language pathologist, so one that's common in our field is called the BESA, the Bilingual English-Spanish Assessment by Elizabeth Pena, which evaluates the language, and it allows for responses in either English or Spanish. I know that's I could put that in the chat too if you're interested.
So Maura, is that the assessment that you just mentioned, is that meant to assess language in the first, or excuse me, language or literacy in the first language?
Language. It's
all right.
both languages. Yeah, because sometimes kids will have some vocabulary in English, even though Spanish is their first language. Certain groups of vocabulary items they might have learned in English only, especially if it's an academic, vocabulary. So you're trying to capture their entire linguistic system to decide if they have, if their language is developing normally or typically, or if they might truly have a language impairment. As far as literacy, I personally don't know of as many or any in Spanish in particular.
Yeah, I think that's where what Amy mentioned,
Yeah.
Acadience, would be good for that. I think it's always, I was listening to a podcast today, and it kind of surprised me because this is one of the major podcasts, and I sort of expected the host to be a little more aware of terms, but I think it's always important to remember the difference between bilingual and biliterate, where bilingual just means like, you can speak in two languages, but biliterate means you can read and write in both languages. So I think it's important to, you may have a student come in who's bilingual, but has not developed any written literacy skills even in their first language. So yeah, it's just a different thing. Here's one that Leslie's recommending, Amplify. Is that, Leslie, is that assessment part of the CKLA curriculum?
It is part of it. It's a component that you actually have to purchase, but it's a great assessment.
Oh, good to know.
See that Acadians also has an assessment in French. Here's the Spanish one. I'll say
And
it.
there was a question that Samantha had a little earlier. Do we have a resource for language comparisons? Yeah, Samantha, can you just unmute and elaborate on that a little bit? I wasn't sure what you meant by language comparisons.
Like, I know there's websites and charts. Someone shared one that was really nice. I can't remember like when, like the,
One.
yeah. And I know like I took an Ames Pathways course this summer. And they had a website and I like cannot find it on their interface, but it was just like, it talks about the different, you know, comparisons of like language, like,
I
and
know
what
the
to
one you're
expect
talking
and what
about.
to focus about. Yeah, I cannot find it on there. I still have access to the course and I've looked and I mean, I haven't looked for like hours, but I can't find it. And it was really great because it went over so many different languages. This is a really nice like touchstone piece, but like we have a Japanese student that's like really struggling. We have some like, you know, we have lots of different students. So it's just very interesting and helpful, I think, when it comes to reading and oral language and like what to really focus on and create those like flooding them with that sound and practicing and that kind of stuff is just nice to know on the front end what they may struggle with.
Amy, maybe you could comment on this. When you talk about building vocabulary in English and using pictures to do that, and can you explain like what that how though pictures are helpful in that circumstance, that when we get down to talking about decoding words in English for English learners or multilinguals, when we talk about decoding, then we don't use those pictures. It's the same process. If you're decoding in, excuse me, if you're decoding in English, it's same process regardless of what your spoken language is. I mean, you need to be able to go from the graphemes to the phonemes and decode the word. And it's just getting to that orthographic mapping. You're not going to be able to get there unless you understand what the word means. And that's where the pictures come in handy. But I've just heard a lot of talk about which I think is sort of a misunderstanding, that science of reading doesn't apply to English learners because they need to do things differently, and we should be able to use 3 cueing with them. We should be able to cue to the pictures to identify what the word is. And I just think there's confusion about, what's the appropriate use of the pictures. Can you just comment on that at all?
Absolutely. And I think that we have to remember Stanislas Dehaene, right? And his work with the brain, the reading brain, and knowing that the visual word form area is in the same spot in the brain, regardless of whatever language you speak. So, and it only forms after you have orthographically mapped the letter sound associations, the pronunciation, and the meaning. So we can't read and retain what we don't understand. So the picture is not a substitution for decoding. It's simply, really, it's just adding to the meaning part. But to get the word to be mapped, you absolutely have to attend to the print and the pronunciation. So it's a teeny tiny, crutch, if you will, that can sort of break down some anxiety. This is where, Nell Duke has her active view of reading, and she talks about executive function and all of those self-regulation things. Just imagine yourself being in a scenario where you don't speak this language and you're looking for ways to process what's happening around you. So certainly images can be useful, but they in no way do they replace the decoding of the word. It's simply just a little hook that's helping with meaning, and then opening up the floodgates to allow us to attack print and spelling and phoneme and pronunciation and all those pieces that have to be there. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I think that I always think that if you are using pictures as a crutch for decoding the word, identifying the word, that really you're shortchanging your student, because now your student is not being required to use the letter sound knowledge to decode the word. So they're going to be missing that piece of the orthographic mapping. So you want to be sure that you do both, that you do actually have the decoding piece where you're focusing on the written graphemes and connecting that to the phonemes, but you then also want to have your vocabulary piece where, of course, for anybody, pictures can be really handy to explain vocabulary. So,
Well, and how many kids would look at this fish and say goldfish, right? Instead of
Right.
just fish.
yeah,
So that's where the picture, if I'm not taking the child back to the word, the actual printed word, they're going to say something else. It's the horse pony example, right? I mean, they're not the same. We have to be more precise in our reading. So I only suggest that as like this particular technique is useful when you're trying to build not language in general, not necessarily decoding. This is more of a language piece, right?
yeah.
And then I can unpack this further. I could create sentences based on what my kids know from the phonics realm. That would certainly be a lovely crossover, but I can also just take it from a language realm and, you know, getting kids to articulate and then go back to their learning to read at where they're at, you know. So it's not a linear progression, right? We can learn our phonemes and we can learn our language. And when I have a second language learner, it's not going to be exact. One is going to lead the other or follow.
Amy's got another question in here. Amy, you want to unmute and kind of pose your question, and maybe Amy can, our Amy can give you some of her thoughts.
Sure. In our district, I think we're all stuck using way too many resources and getting like overwhelmed. And we've been talking about the need for maybe a first year newcomer scope and sequence, a second year, just because we're trying to do things similarly between our schools. So we're just struggling. We wanted to hear what some other people are using for resources that they find to be valuable.
Well, that's a big can of worms to unpack. You know, are you thinking primary, elementary, what grade level? Secondary.
High school, yep.
Okay. So secondary, and these are, where are they on their EP level? 1, 2, 3.
Most of them
Newcomers,
we're talking
newcomers.
about,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Ones
So
and
what
twos.
we recommend in our region is a curriculum referred to as direct instruction of spoken English. It is a direct instruction program, and there are 2 levels to it. Now, I'm not saying that this is the be all end all. I'm just saying that when we have a scenario where I have a teacher who may not be proficient at teaching ELs, and now she has an 8th grader who speaks no English, we have an obligation to try to teach them English. So this scripted program is useful for that purpose. And it begins at the conversational level, very basic, and carries forward. So as something that I've seen support students in our area, especially with teachers who don't have as much training on how to support ELs, it's a useful resource. I'm seeing, yeah, so that's called Direct Instruction for Spoken English, and it is through the National Direct, I will put the link in, we'll just go that way. Nifty.org, National Institute for Direct Instruction is where you can find it.
Okay.
And I'll share my screen again. There are other ones for younger students, but this is great for grade 4 and above. So I go into programs, EL, and then it takes me to DICE. This gives a little blurb about it. And then if you want to purchase it or see where, then you click, it takes you to a different site.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can put this in the chat. It's fairly affordable because it's a one-time, you know, you just have to buy it once and then you have it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I'm talking to our literacy coach. She was kind of thinking of some actual science of reading. I don't remember like the beginning, to start at the beginning for our ELLs, and so
Well,
I looked at some of it and I'm like, I just wasn't sure if it.
and there are a ton of tools. There are also, this is also controversial. There are many English language learner teachers who would say, don't use a scripted program. Like, that we should have it, it should be natural. It should be unconstrained. And I totally understand that. I'm looking for resources that might help a teacher that doesn't have that background knowledge and maybe doesn't speak the same language as the student sitting in front of them. So I found this to be useful in that realm. But it is a 90-minute lesson, and the Science of Reading connection. So this is Zig Engelman, who is the author of sort of Big DI. Yeah, and this is his program.
Okay.
I will say that he's a little bit harsh on accent. So whatever you see related to accent, just relax on that. It's okay if they have. That would be one critique I would give.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Maura, for sharing the WIDA as well. That there's so many excellent tools on WIDA.
I have a question that maybe is not pertinent to most people, but I'm just curious about it. If you have, say, and this is about little children, so if they either they're English speakers and they go to a bilingual preschool or an immersion preschool in a different language, or they speak a different language, say they speak Spanish and they go to one of those programs, and so they're in their preschool, say when they get to be about 3 or 4, they're starting to, in the preschool, learn some, and say the preschool that is like a Spanish immersion. So they're starting to learn some of those sound symbol correspondences in Spanish and some very, very, very beginning literate skills in Spanish. Would you ever suggest outside of the preschool teaching the English version of that, if you know they're going to the next year go into an all English speaking kindergarten? Or would you is that too confusing? Would you just do, if you're teaching the literacy of a language, and this would be true, like I guess in Milwaukee, in any of the immersion schools, do they just teach literacy in one language first and then teach it in English? Or is it a mixture of the two? I'm just curious how that would work, and what's too confusing for kids when they're young.
I'm sure there are some on this call that would be very adept at answering that question. I will give my answer, and then if somebody wants to chime in, please do. In my experience, I worked in 2 bilingual buildings where there were separate classrooms where the 4-year-olds were only being instructed in Spanish. Like kindergarten, you could choose to only have Spanish only instruction. And then when they got to, we did introduce English through Language for Learning at the time for about a very limited time per day, about half hour per day. They got some spoken language instruction using Language for Learning, but they weren't expected to learn to read in English until they had learned to read in Spanish. Now, that was that model. I don't know if it was right or wrong, but that was the model that I'm familiar with. I'm going to pass it. I saw Christina, you turned your camera on. Did you want to share? Or, if anyone has anything they want to share on it. So I don't know that there's a right or a wrong. I know that they're spongy when they're that little. So withholding is probably not the best idea because you can accelerate growth in that second language
Yeah, I
With-
see,
yeah.
I see Samantha posted that in the immersion schools in Milwaukee. They start in K4 and they do everything in the target language. And then they don't really begin their English instruction until second grade,
Second grade, yeah.
which is fine, except the only thing that concerns me about that is English is so complicated compared to some of these other languages. And now you're not starting until second grade. And what does that, then what happens with assessments for those kids if they're being assessed in English and now they appear to be way behind, even though they might be doing fine in whatever their immersion target language is. I don't know. It's just kind of a,
I would take the reverse, because to be able to speak a second language is true gift. So, and you want to,
Yeah.
they're gonna learn English.
Yeah.
They might
We're
lose their first language.
exploring, we're exploring immersion for our child because there's 3 immersion programs. Actually, there's 5 in Milwaukee, but there's 3 within like very close to us. And the principal and admin there have just expressed like, we understand our data is not going to be great until probably 4th or 5th grade, because they understand like English takes 2 to 3 years to acquire print literacy. And it depends on the school, because like you can learn to read Spanish in 6 months because it's a very regular language. English, it takes 2 to 3 years. Italian, it takes typically 3 months because they're just so regular. So it truly depends on. Chinese much longer. There's a Chinese immersion school in Milwaukee. So it just really depends on the language in school and target language. But yeah, they just expect that their forward data in 3rd and 4th grade is just not going to be great. They just kind of have accepted that, knowing their students are going to leave essentially like coordinate bilinguals.
Mhm.
Christina, did you have something that you wanted to add to that? Just unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Sure, I just didn't know. No, my room light went off because I wasn't moving around. So, but I also, yeah, I was in a dual language immersion program in Madison, one of the teachers there at the first in Nuestro Mundo. And so, it all depends on the student too, because I had a student whose grandma on the side was teaching the reading at home in English while we were focusing at school in the school environment on the target language, which was Spanish. So, but I agree, it is a tricky thing because I'm no longer in Madison due to other things. I love the dual language immersion program, but there are struggles because it's not clear, like testing. We know that there's a lot going on with our students, and there are studies that can maybe go one side or the other, but each student is different and each student is ready. And I know in another situation, several years ago, there was a student where it was just decided, no, this student needs to learn literacy only in one. We shouldn't confuse them with other. It's hard to, I want to ask you guys as a specialist, what do you think? Because I agree, it's really hard. And I don't know, every family has a different way of approaching becoming biliterate or bilingual or multilingual. And it works differently for every family. I mean, some kids can't speak a lick of a second language, or even though their parents are bilingual and biliterate. It all depends on how it's done. Some can speak 3, some I could go on, but I'll stop. But I'd like to hear what all you have to say.
Thank you, Christina.
No, I think that's true, and you get homes that just taking Spanish as an example, you get homes where both parents speak only Spanish at home, and that's all the child hears at home, and that's the language that the parents are literate in. They're not necessarily very literate in English. But then you have other homes where you have like one English speaking person, one Spanish speaking person. They're both speaking their languages to their child. The child is pretty bilingual, but then you kind of, I think you come to this point where you wonder like, okay, it's time to start the literacy aspect. In which language are we going to try to do both together? Are we going to choose one and do that first, then another? And so I just appreciate, any ideas that people had. It's interesting to me. I just wanted to point out that I do have I posted in the chat a link if you need a certificate of attendance for any reason. I believe it's in there. Yep, it's in there. So if you want to request a certificate of attendance, if you would fill that form out tonight, and then I'll send those certificates out tomorrow. And do you want to just go through our upcoming events, Maura? And I will
Yes,
try to
I
post some
would-
of these.
Yeah, I'd love to have your help too, but we have, well, May 1st is a big event where the Reading League is unveiling their first batch of curriculum reviews. Is that an accurate portrayal of
Yeah,
that?
yes, yes.
Okay, and you can join live on May 1st if you would like to. Otherwise, I'm sure it'll be available. And that's through the Reading League Compass
Yeah,
site.
Compass. If you go to the National Reading League website under Compass, all that information will be there. But, you know, they had developed a couple of years ago some curriculum guidelines that schools, districts could use to evaluate curriculum. But then they've now used those guidelines themselves to go through quite a large number of the most commonly used reading programs in the country, and are now preparing to make their results public of what are the advantages and disadvantages and pros and cons of these various different programs that are out there. Okay.
We also have 2 book studies. One is through the Reading League Wisconsin, and it's teaching words and how they work. So that will be starting in June, correct, Mary?
Yes, I'm just posting that now.
Okay. And
So
then there's,
yeah, and that book is all about vocabulary, obviously, and it's about English vocabulary. And Freddie Hebert, who is the author of that book, is one of the speakers at our conference in October this year.
yes.
And I just wanted to mention at our conference, we're having Antonio Fierro, who is bilingual himself, and that's his area of expertise is instruction for both multilingual and bilingual children and English learners. And so our fall conference is live in Brookfield, but we also are live streaming it. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'm going to post in the chat. Let's see here. I'll post this one down here. Oops, it's the wrong one.
Yeah.
I have too
Turning
many
the
things
tide.
here.
Yeah, but yeah, if you can make the conference, it's going to be fantastic on October 4th,
4th,
either
right.
live or on virtually.
Yep, I will
Absolutely.
pull that up momentarily. I'm scrolling back and forth and
Yes. And then there's another book study that is self-paced, and it's an all chapter book study through the Reading League on effective universal instruction. So that's another upcoming event.
And I will, if you hold on just 1 second, I will post some information on that. And that's one where it starts in June, but then there is an online meeting in June, on June 17th, and then there's not another live meeting until the end, which is July 29th, but you get emails every week about this. It would be good to be reading this chapter now, and here are some additional things that you can read to go along with that. So just a different kind of a book study. The one that we do through our chapter on vocabulary is we meet online in person and discuss a couple chapters a week, and it's a more traditional approach, and this other one is a self-paced approach. So that's all I had to put in there, Maura.
Okay. Great. Any other questions or comments before we sign off?
I just want to thank Amy
Well, thank
for
you
stepping in
Oh, yeah,
and
go
doing
ahead,
this.
Christina.
Quick question. Yeah, quick question. Is there anything related to dyslexia that you recommend I would learn about? Because sometimes you meet a child initially and you can tell in their first language that they're reversing and doing a lot of other things. Are there resources for us to use?
Oh, there are many, many resources. Now, are you in Wisconsin, Christina?
Yes.
Yes,
Mhm.
okay. You might want to join the Decoding Dyslexia Facebook group. There's a lot of information on there and a lot of knowledgeable both tutors and parents, and you can get a lot of information on there. The International Dyslexia Association has a lot of information on their website. Actually, speaking of our fall conference, one of our speakers is Jack Fletcher, recently retired from the University of Houston, and he is probably the preeminent dyslexia researcher in the United States, and he'll be speaking about dyslexia. So yeah, there's a lot of information out there. That's sort of the area that I've worked in, with my involvement with reading is kids who are dyslexic, and yeah, it's good to know more about it. But those are, I would suggest going to the IDA site and then joining the Decoding Dyslexia Wisconsin Facebook group. And
I would say too that, like what you mentioned, but also talks about how Spanish speakers and EL students in general are under-identified as dyslexic. So from my experience, what works for the native English speaker who's dyslexic also works for the Spanish speaker. So systematic sequential phonics,